5 years ago, Christopher Johnson, a 13-year-old boy from Detroit, Michigan, disappeared without a trace from within the walls of his own school after months of relentless bullying from classmates. The vanishing plunged his family into unimaginable tragedy and depression, while the entire community was left in utter confusion. Police considered multiple possibilities but failed to solve the case, causing outrage among Christopher's family, who never lost hope. They fought tirelessly for the truth to come to light. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we reopen cold cases with respect and evidence. It was March 15th, 2018, a bitter cold Thursday morning that would forever be etched in the memory of everyone at Jefferson Middle School on Detroit's struggling east side. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and a thin layer of ice covered the cracked sidewalks leading to the aging brick building that had served the community for over 60 years. Christopher Johnson, bundled in a worn navy blue winter coat that was slightly too big for his small frame, walked through those familiar hallways for what would be the last time anyone would see him alive. At 13, Christopher stood barely 5 feet tall and weighed less than 100 pounds, making him one of the smallest students in his grade. His thick-rimmed glasses, held together with clear tape on one side from a previous encounter with his tormentors, constantly slipped down his nose as he navigated the crowded corridors. His brown hair was perpetually unkempt, not from neglect, but from the nervous habit he had developed of running his fingers through it whenever he felt anxious, which in recent months had been almost constantly. Christopher carried with him that morning a faded black JanSport backpack that had belonged to his older cousin Marcus, now in college. Inside were his carefully organized school supplies, notebooks with meticulously written notes in his distinctive small handwriting, mechanical pencils arranged in a clear plastic case, and a scientific calculator that had been a birthday gift from his parents the previous year. Hidden beneath his textbooks was something else, a small digital recorder that he had borrowed from his father's toolbox, along with a notebook containing detailed documentation of every incident of harassment he had endured over the past 3 months. The bullying had escalated dramatically since the beginning of the school year, transforming from occasional name-calling to a systematic campaign of psychological and physical torment. Christopher's crime, in the eyes of his tormentors, was simply being different. While other boys his age obsessed over sports statistics and video games, Christopher spent his lunch periods in the library reading about marine biology and quantum physics. He dreamed of becoming a marine biologist, fascinated by the mysterious creatures that lived in the deepest parts of the ocean, where sunlight never reached. Security footage recovered from that fateful day shows Christopher entering Jefferson Middle School at exactly 7:42 a.m. through the main entrance on Gratiot Avenue. He moved through the hallways with his head down, a defensive posture he had adopted to avoid making eye contact with potential aggressors. His small frame seemed even more diminished as he navigated between clusters of larger, more confident students who barely acknowledged his existence. Christopher's first class was Advanced Mathematics with Mrs. Patricia Williams, a veteran teacher who had worked at Jefferson for over 20 years. She later told investigators that Christopher seemed more withdrawn than usual that morning, constantly checking his watch and appearing distracted during the lesson on algebraic equations that normally would have captured his complete attention. At 8:47 a.m., when the bell rang ending first period, Christopher remained seated for several extra seconds, as if gathering courage for what lay ahead. His second class, English Literature with Mr. David Rodriguez, provided a brief respite from his anxiety. Christopher had always excelled in English, finding solace in the written word and the ability to express complex thoughts through essays and creative writing assignments. That morning, the class was discussing To Kill a Mockingbird, and Christopher had raised his hand to make an insightful comment about the theme of moral courage in the face of adversity. His teacher later reflected on the tragic irony of that discussion, given what was about to unfold. At 10:15 a.m., during the chaotic 10-minute transition between second and third periods, security cameras captured Christopher walking purposefully toward the east wing of the building. Unlike his usual tentative movements, he seemed determined, almost resolute. He was heading toward the basement-level bathroom near the gymnasium, a location that students typically avoided due to its poor lighting and reputation as a place where troublemakers congregated. This particular bathroom had been the site of several previous incidents involving Christopher and his tormentors. The basement location made it isolated from teacher supervision, and its position near the old boiler room meant that sounds from within were often masked by the mechanical noise of the building's aging heating system. It was here, in this dimly lit, tile-walled space that smelled perpetually of industrial disinfectant and teenage desperation, that Christopher Johnson would make his final stand. When Christopher failed to appear for his third-period science class with Mrs. Jennifer Martinez, his absence was initially attributed to a possible illness or family emergency. Mrs. Martinez, who had taught Christopher since the beginning of the school year and recognized his perfect attendance record, made a note to follow up with the main office. However, the chaotic nature of middle school daily operations meant that this follow-up was delayed until much later in the day. The three boys, who had made Christopher Johnson's life a living hell, represented different aspects of the social hierarchy that dominated Jefferson Middle School's toxic ecosystem. Each brought their own motivations and methods to the systematic campaign of harassment that had been building toward a devastating crescendo throughout the winter months of 2018. Marcus Webb, 14 years old and already standing 6 feet tall, was the undisputed king of Jefferson Middle School's social pyramid. As the star player on the basketball team that had won the district championship the previous year, Marcus commanded respect and fear in equal measure from his peers. His athletic prowess had earned him early attention from high school scouts, and college recruiters were already expressing interest in his potential. Born into a middle-class family in one of Detroit's more stable neighborhoods, Marcus had never known the kind of economic hardship that plagued many of his classmates. Marcus's bullying of Christopher was calculated and psychological rather than overtly physical. He had perfected the art of public humiliation, making jokes at Christopher's expense during lunch periods when the cafeteria was packed with potential audiences. His comments were always clever enough to draw laughs from bystanders, but cruel enough to cut deeply into his victim's self-esteem. Marcus seemed to take particular pleasure in mocking Christopher's academic achievements, referring to him as Einstein, in a tone dripping with sarcasm, whenever Christopher answered questions correctly in class. The second member of this toxic triangle was Ryan Torres, 13 years old and the son of Sergeant Miguel Torres of the Detroit Police Department's 9th Precinct. Ryan carried himself with the swagger that came from knowing his father's position, provided him with a certain level of protection from serious consequences. Unlike Marcus, whose bullying was more sophisticated, Ryan preferred direct intimidation tactics. He would corner Christopher in hallways, slam locker doors just as Christopher was retrieving books, and engage in the kind of physical pushing and shoving that could be dismissed as horsing around if questioned by adults. Ryan's family lived in a modest 2-story house just 3 blocks from Jefferson Middle School, and his father's patrol car was often parked in their driveway, serving as a constant reminder of the law enforcement connections that seemed to make Ryan untouchable. Sergeant Torres had served the Detroit community for over 15 years and was generally respected by his colleagues and neighbors. He had no idea that his son was using the family's reputation as a shield for increasingly aggressive behavior toward a vulnerable classmate. The most volatile and unpredictable member of the group was Jake Morrison, 14 years old, despite being in the same grade due to having been held back in elementary school. Jake came from the most troubled background of the 3 boys, living with his single mother in a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of the school district. His father had abandoned the family when Jake was 7, leaving behind only a mountain of debt and a legacy of anger that Jake seemed to have inherited. Jake's uncle, Tom Morrison, owned a small construction company that specialized in emergency repairs and renovation work for institutional clients, including several Detroit area schools. Tom had become something of a father figure to Jake, employing the boy part-time during summers and weekends to help with simple tasks and keep him out of trouble. This relationship would prove crucial to the events that were about to unfold, though no one could have predicted the dark turn it would eventually take. Jake's bullying of Christopher was the most physical and unpredictable of the 3 boys. While Marcus relied on psychological warfare and Ryan used intimidation, Jake's approach was more direct and often violent. He had been responsible for the broken glasses that Christopher now wore, held together with tape, having knocked them off the smaller boy's face during an accidental collision in the hallway 2 weeks earlier. Jake's volatile temper and unpredictable mood swings made him the most dangerous of Christopher's tormentors. The dynamic between these 3 boys was complex and competitive. Each seemed to be trying to outdo the others in their treatment of Christopher, escalating their behavior in an attempt to maintain their position within their informal hierarchy. What had started as occasional teasing had evolved into a systematic campaign of harassment that was slowly breaking down Christopher's psychological defenses and pushing him toward a breaking point that none of them fully understood. Christopher's mother, Sarah Johnson, had been fighting an increasingly desperate battle to protect her son throughout the winter months. A registered nurse at Detroit Medical Center, Sarah worked long shifts in the emergency department, often coming home exhausted, but still finding time to help Christopher with his homework and listen to his accounts of the daily torment he endured at school. She had documented every incident he reported, keeping a detailed journal that included dates, times, witnesses, and the specific nature of each encounter. Sarah's complaints to the school administration had become more frequent and more urgent as the situation deteriorated. She had met with Principal Robert Hayes on at least 8 occasions, each time presenting evidence of the ongoing harassment and demanding action. Hayes, a 58-year-old veteran educator who had been running Jefferson Middle School for over a decade, seemed more concerned with maintaining the school's reputation than addressing the systematic bullying taking place under his watch. The responses Sarah received from the administration were consistently dismissive and inadequate. She was told that boys will be boys, that Christopher needed to toughen up, and that the incidents were being addressed appropriately. When she threatened to involve the police or the school district's central administration, Hayes assured her that such drastic measures were unnecessary and might actually make things worse for Christopher by drawing unwanted attention to his situation. Christopher's father, Michael Johnson, approached the problem from a different angle. A skilled construction worker who had spent 20 years building and renovating homes throughout the Detroit metropolitan area, Michael believed in direct action and personal responsibility. He had taught Christopher basic self-defense techniques and encouraged his son to stand up to his tormentors physically if necessary. This advice, while well-intentioned, put Christopher in an impossible position between his father's expectations and his own naturally gentle disposition. The family's frustration reached a peak during the week leading up to Christopher's disappearance. Michael had considered confronting the boy's parents directly, while Sarah had begun researching private schools that might provide a safer environment for their son. Christopher himself had been developing his own plan, one that his parents were unaware of, and that would ultimately lead to the tragedy that destroyed multiple families. The night before Christopher Johnson disappeared, the Johnson family home on Mack Avenue was filled with an unusual tension that seemed to electrify the air like the static charge before a thunderstorm. Christopher had been different that evening. Not the defeated, anxious boy who'd been coming home from school for months, but someone who seemed to have found a new sense of purpose and determination that both relieved and worried his parents. During dinner, Christopher had been more talkative than he had been in weeks. He asked his younger sister Emma about her friends at elementary school, helped her with her math homework without being asked, and even managed to smile at one of his father's corny jokes about construction work. Sarah Johnson later told investigators that she had felt a moment of hope that evening, thinking perhaps the worst of Christopher's ordeal was behind them, and that he was finally learning to cope with the situation at school. What Sarah and Michael didn't know was that Christopher had spent the previous 3 weeks conducting his own investigation into the boys who had been tormenting him. Using skills he had learned in his computer literacy class and techniques he had discovered through online research, Christopher had been systematically documenting not just the bullying incidents, but other questionable activities that Marcus, Ryan, and Jake engaged in when they thought no one was watching. Christopher's bedroom, which police would later search thoroughly, contained evidence of this amateur detective work hidden in places his parents never would have thought to look. Behind his desk, taped to the underside of a drawer, was a detailed timeline of events spanning 3 months. The notebook contained not just accounts of his own harassment, but observations about the 3 boys' behavior during lunch periods, after-school activities, and even glimpses of their weekend activities that he had witnessed during family outings around the neighborhood. The most damaging evidence Christopher had collected involved the boys' involvement in petty criminal activities that went far beyond typical teenage mischief. Using a small digital recorder borrowed from his father's toolbox, Christopher had captured conversations in which Marcus bragged about stealing merchandise from local stores. Ryan discussed using his father's police credentials to avoid consequences for various infractions, and Jake detailed acts of vandalism against school property and neighborhood homes. Christopher had also discovered that the 3 boys had been systematically cheating on tests and assignments, using a network of older students and even some teachers' children to obtain answer keys and completed homework. This academic dishonesty was particularly galling to Christopher, whose own grades suffered because he refused to compromise his integrity, even when doing so might have helped him fit in better with his peers. The plan Christopher had been developing was both naive and dangerous. He intended to present his evidence to Principal Hayes, believing that concrete proof of the boys' wrongdoing would finally force the administration to take decisive action. Christopher had scheduled a meeting with Hayes for the afternoon of March 15th, planning to arrive with his notebook, recordings, and a formal written complaint that he had been drafting and revising for days. What Christopher failed to understand was the complex web of relationships and interests that protected his tormentors. Marcus Webb's basketball prowess made him valuable to a school district struggling with budget cuts and declining enrollment. Ryan Torres's father was not just any police officer, but someone who had personal relationships with school board members and district administrators. Jake Morrison's connection to his uncle's construction company had already proven useful to the school on several occasions when emergency repairs were needed quickly and quietly. Emma Johnson, then 11 years old, had been aware that something significant was happening with her older brother, though she didn't understand the full scope of his situation. Years later, during therapy sessions designed to help her process the trauma of losing Christopher, Emma would recall conversations and observations from that final week that took on ominous significance in retrospect. Christopher kept talking about how everything was going to change, Emma told her therapist. He said that after Thursday, people would have to take him seriously, that he wasn't going to be invisible anymore. I thought he meant he was going to try out for a school club or something. I never imagined he was planning something that could get him hurt. Emma also remembered finding Christopher awake in the middle of the night on several occasions during that final week, sitting at his desk with papers spread around him, writing by the light of a small desk lamp. When she asked what he was doing, he told her he was working on a project that was going to change everything. The intensity in his voice when he said this had frightened her, though she couldn't articulate why at the time. Christopher's best friend, David Chen, had been the closest thing to a confidant that Christopher had during this period. Though even David wasn't privy to the full extent of Christopher's investigation, David later told police that Christopher had seemed different in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. More secretive, but also more confident. Christopher had started talking about having something on them, and about how the truth always comes out eventually. The most significant conversation between Christopher and David had occurred 2 days before the disappearance, during lunch period, while they sat in their usual spot in the school library. Christopher had shown David a small portion of his evidence, recordings of Marcus and the others laughing about incidents of bullying, discussing their criminal activities, and making derogatory comments about other students and even some teachers. "I couldn't believe what I was hearing," David would later testify during Jake Morrison's trial. These weren't just mean comments or typical teenage stuff. They were talking about real crimes, about hurting people, about how they could get away with anything because of who their families were. Christopher was excited because he thought this would finally make the adults listen to him. David had urged Christopher to be careful, sensing that confronting the 3 boys with this kind of evidence could be dangerous. But Christopher had already made up his mind. He was tired of being a victim, tired of being ignored, tired of watching his tormentors face no consequences for their actions. He was going to take his evidence to Principal Hayes, and if Hayes didn't act, he was prepared to go to the police, the school board, and even the local media if necessary. The tragic irony was that Christopher's investigation had been more thorough and more successful than he realized. Had he lived to present his findings, the evidence he had gathered would likely have resulted in serious consequences for all 3 boys and significant changes in how Jefferson Middle School handled bullying cases. Instead, his pursuit of justice became the catalyst for his own destruction. The events of March 15, 2018 began unfolding at 5:47 a.m. when Christopher Johnson's alarm clock jolted him awake in his small bedroom on the 2nd floor of the family's modest 2-story home on Mack Avenue. Unlike most mornings when he would hit the snooze button multiple times, Christopher immediately sat up in bed, fully alert and focused on the day ahead. He had rehearsed this morning dozens of times in his mind, knowing that everything had to go perfectly if his plan was going to work. Christopher's morning routine was methodical and deliberate. He showered longer than usual, taking time to mentally review the evidence he had compiled and the presentation he planned to make to Principal Hayes. He dressed carefully in his best clothes, a navy blue button-down shirt his grandmother had given him for Christmas, khaki pants that his mother had pressed the night before, and his only pair of dress shoes, which he had polished to a shine using techniques his father had taught him. Downstairs in the kitchen, Sarah Johnson was preparing breakfast while simultaneously getting ready for another grueling 12-hour shift in the emergency department at Detroit Medical Center. She noticed immediately that Christopher seemed different that morning, more alert, more purposeful, almost excited in a way that she hadn't seen in months. When she commented on his unusually formal attire, Christopher told her he had an important presentation to give at school, which wasn't entirely untrue. Michael Johnson had already left for work by the time Christopher came downstairs, but he had left a note for his son tucked under his breakfast plate. "Have a great day, kiddo. Remember what we talked about. Sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's scary. Love, Dad." Christopher folded the note carefully and put it in his wallet, drawing strength from his father's words without fully understanding how prophetic they would prove to be. Emma Johnson was in her typical preschool rush, searching for a missing homework assignment while simultaneously trying to eat her cereal and watch morning cartoons. But even in her distracted state, she noticed that Christopher seemed different. "You look fancy today," she told him with the casual honesty that only younger siblings can deliver. "Are you trying to impress someone?" Christopher had smiled at her comment, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him in weeks. Before leaving for school, Christopher made a final check of his backpack, ensuring that all of his evidence was properly organized and secure. The digital recorder was fully charged and tested. His notebook was wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from the morning's freezing rain. The printed copies of his written complaint were stored in a folder labeled "Important, Do Not Bend." He had even prepared backup copies of everything, which he planned to leave in his locker as insurance. The walk to Jefferson Middle School that morning took Christopher through several blocks of Detroit's East Side, past abandoned lots and boarded-up houses that told the story of a community struggling with economic decline and social challenges. But Christopher barely noticed his surroundings, focused entirely on the confrontation he knew was coming. He had considered multiple scenarios for how the day might unfold, but in his 13-year-old optimism, he believed that truth and justice would ultimately prevail. Security footage from the school's exterior cameras shows Christopher approaching the building at 7:38 a.m., 4 minutes earlier than his usual arrival time. He paused at the main entrance, taking several deep breaths and adjusting his backpack straps before pushing through the heavy glass doors into the lobby. His body language in these final recorded moments shows determination rather than his usual defensive posture. Shoulders back, head up, walking with purpose rather than trying to blend into the background. Christopher's first stop inside the building was his locker, number 247, on the second floor near the mathematics wing. Security cameras in the hallway captured him carefully removing items from his backpack and organizing them inside the narrow metal space. This was when he hid his backup evidence, ensuring that even if something happened to his primary documentation, there would still be proof of what Marcus, Ryan, and Jake had been doing. The morning classes proceeded normally, with Christopher participating more actively than he had in months. Mrs. Williams, his mathematics teacher, later told investigators that Christopher had seemed different, more confident during first period. He had volunteered to solve a complex equation on the whiteboard, something he normally would have avoided to prevent drawing attention to himself. When he completed the problem correctly, earning applause from his classmates, Christopher had actually smiled with genuine pride. Second period English literature with Mr. Rodriguez had been equally encouraging for Christopher. The class discussion about moral courage in To Kill a Mockingbird had resonated deeply with him, and he had made several insightful comments about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when facing overwhelming opposition. Mr. Rodriguez later reflected that Christopher seemed to be drawing parallels between the fictional story and his own situation, though the teacher didn't fully understand the connection at the time. During the break between second and third periods, Christopher made his way to the main office to confirm his afternoon appointment with Principal Hayes. The secretary, Mrs. Dorothy Patterson, who had worked at Jefferson for over 20 years, noted that Christopher seemed unusually formal and mature in his request. He asked if Mr. Hayes would have time to discuss an important matter regarding student safety, she later recalled. I told him his 3 p.m. appointment was still scheduled, and he thanked me very politely before leaving. It was at this point that Christopher's plan began to deviate from his careful preparations. As he walked toward his third period science class, he encountered Marcus Webb, Ryan Torres, and Jake Morrison gathered near the East Wing stairwell. The 3 boys were engaged in animated conversation about something that had clearly upset them, and when they saw Christopher approaching, their discussion immediately stopped. What Christopher didn't know was that the 3 boys had learned about his investigation. Jake Morrison's girlfriend, Ashley Martinez, had overheard Christopher talking to David Chen about his evidence and had reported the conversation to Jake out of loyalty to her boyfriend. The 3 boys had spent the previous evening in panic mode, trying to figure out how much Christopher knew and what they should do about it. The confrontation that followed would be the last interaction Christopher Johnson would ever have with his tormentors, and the beginning of a cover-up that would span 5 years and ultimately destroy multiple lives. What happened in the basement bathroom of Jefferson Middle School between 10:15 and 10:45 a.m. on March 15, 2018, would remain a mystery for over 5 years until Jake Morrison's eventual confession provided the horrific details that investigators had been seeking. The encounter began when Marcus Webb intercepted Christopher in the hallway, suggesting with false friendliness that they talk things over in a private location where they wouldn't be interrupted by teachers or other students. Christopher, despite his careful planning and newfound confidence, was still fundamentally a trusting 13-year-old who wanted to believe that his tormentors might be willing to listen to reason. When Marcus suggested they go to the basement bathroom to work things out, Christopher agreed, thinking that perhaps his preparation and evidence had already begun to have an impact. He followed the 3 boys down the seldom-used stairwell, his backpack heavy with the documentation he believed would finally bring justice. The basement level of Jefferson Middle School was a dimly lit maze of storage rooms, mechanical equipment, and facilities that students rarely had reason to visit. The bathroom they entered was located near the old boiler room, where the constant hum and vibration of machinery masked sounds from the surrounding areas. The space smelled of industrial cleaning supplies and dampness, with flickering fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows on the cracked tile walls. According to Jake Morrison's eventual confession, given during plea negotiations 5 years later, the confrontation began civilly enough. Marcus, acting as the spokesperson for the group, asked Christopher what he thought he was doing with his little investigation. Christopher, emboldened by months of preparation and his father's advice about standing up for what's right, had responded with unexpected defiance. "I'm doing what someone should have done months ago," Christopher had replied, his voice stronger than any of the boys had ever heard it before. "I'm making sure people know the truth about what you've been doing, not just to me, but to other kids, and all the other things you think you can get away with because of who your families are." Christopher had then made what would prove to be a fatal mistake. He revealed the extent of his evidence. He told the 3 boys about his recordings, his detailed documentation, his scheduled meeting with Principal Hayes, and his plans to go to higher authorities if the school administration failed to act. What Christopher intended as a demonstration of his determination and preparation instead triggered a panic response from his tormentors, who suddenly realized the serious legal and social consequences they could face if his evidence became public. Ryan Torres, whose father's police career could be destroyed by association with his son's criminal activities, had been the first to become physically aggressive. He grabbed Christopher's backpack, demanding to see the evidence immediately. When Christopher tried to resist, pulling the bag away and backing toward the bathroom exit, Jake Morrison moved to block his path, while Marcus positioned himself between Christopher and the door. The 3 boys were significantly larger and stronger than Christopher, and their years of athletic training gave them physical advantages that the smaller boy could never overcome. However, Christopher's desperation and determination gave him a temporary burst of courage that surprised his attackers. He managed to break free from Ryan's initial grab and attempted to push past Jake toward the exit. This was when the situation escalated beyond anyone's intentions or control. Jake Morrison, whose volatile temper and troubled background had made him the most unpredictable member of the group, reacted to Christopher's resistance with explosive violence. He shoved Christopher hard against the tile wall, causing the smaller boy to stumble and fall backward toward the row of sinks mounted along the far wall. Christopher struck his head on the sharp edge of a porcelain sink with a sickening crack that echoed through the basement bathroom. The impact was immediately followed by an unnatural silence as all 4 boys realized something terrible had just occurred. Christopher collapsed to the cold tile floor, blood beginning to pool beneath his head as his thick-rimmed glasses skittered across the bathroom floor, one lens cracked and the frame bent beyond repair. For several crucial seconds, the 3 boys stood frozen in shock and disbelief. Christopher was completely motionless, his small body crumpled in an unnatural position against the base of the sink. Marcus was the first to approach, kneeling down and checking for signs of life, while Ryan and Jake watched in growing horror. When Marcus looked up at his companions, his face was pale with terror. "He's not breathing," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the mechanical noise from the boiler room. "Oh God, I think he's dead." The realization of what had just occurred triggered three very different responses from Christopher's killers. Marcus, whose future college basketball career and family reputation were now in jeopardy, immediately began calculating how to minimize the damage to himself. Ryan, whose father's law enforcement connections had always protected him from serious consequences, started thinking about alibis and evidence. Jake, whose explosive temper had caused the fatal injury, was consumed by panic and guilt. For the next 10 minutes, the three boys stood over Christopher's motionless body, each processing the magnitude of what had just happened while trying to figure out what to do next. They checked his pulse repeatedly, hoping against hope that he might regain consciousness, but it became increasingly clear that Christopher Johnson was dead and that their lives had just changed forever. It was Jake who first suggested involving his uncle Tom Morrison, the construction contractor, who had been like a father figure to him and who had the resources and connections that might help them avoid the catastrophic consequences of their actions. Using a cell phone that he wasn't supposed to have in school, Jake called his uncle and, speaking in code, requested an emergency meeting after school hours. The three boys then worked together to stage the scene, making it appear that Christopher had simply never been in the bathroom at all. They cleaned up the blood as best they could using paper towels and water from the sinks, though forensic investigators would later find microscopic traces that had been impossible to remove completely. They took Christopher's backpack and its incriminating contents, along with his broken glasses and any other evidence that he had been in that location. Marcus Webb used his status as a star athlete to create alibis for all three boys, ensuring they were seen in different locations around the school during the time period when Christopher would officially be reported missing. Ryan Torres relied on his scheduled detention in the principal's office to establish his whereabouts. Jake Morrison simply left school early, claiming to be ill, a story his mother would later corroborate to police investigators. By the time the school day ended and Christopher's absence from classes was officially noted, his body was hidden in a location where it would remain undiscovered for over 5 years, and three teenagers had begun a conspiracy of silence that would ultimately involve multiple adults and cover up one of the most tragic crimes in Jefferson Middle School's history. If this case has already gripped you, hit the like button. It helps Christopher's story reach more people. Tom Morrison received his nephew's frantic phone call at 11:23 a.m. while he was reviewing blueprints for a commercial renovation project in downtown Detroit. At first, the seasoned contractor thought Jake was simply in trouble for fighting or skipping classes, the kind of adolescent problems he had helped his nephew navigate many times before. But the tremor in Jake's voice and his cryptic references to something really bad and needing help right away convinced Tom that this situation was different and potentially serious. Tom Morrison was a 47-year-old divorced father of 2 who had built his construction business from nothing over the course of 20 years. Morrison Construction specialized in emergency repair work for institutional clients, particularly schools and government buildings that needed quick, discreet fixes to maintain their operations. Tom's reputation for reliability and his willingness to work odd hours had made him a trusted contractor among Detroit's public institutions, including Jefferson Middle School, where he had completed several projects over the past decade. The relationship between Tom and his nephew Jake was complicated by family dynamics that went back years. When Jake's father had abandoned the family, Tom had stepped in to provide both financial support and masculine guidance to his troubled nephew. Tom saw something of his own difficult childhood in Jake's struggles, and he had invested considerable time and money trying to keep the boy on the right path. This emotional investment would ultimately cloud Tom's judgment when Jake needed help covering up the most serious crime of his young life. Tom's initial response to Jake's phone call was to arrange a meeting after school hours when they could talk privately without interference from school officials or other students. Tom told Jake to stay calm, avoid drawing attention to himself, and meet him in the school parking lot at 4:30 p.m., 30 minutes after the official end of classes, when most students and staff would have left the building. What Tom didn't realize was that he was about to become an accessory to murder and the architect of a cover-up that would torment him for the rest of his life. The meeting in the parking lot lasted less than 10 minutes. But it was long enough for Jake to confess the basic facts of what had happened in the basement bathroom. Tom's initial reaction was disbelief, followed by anger at his nephew's involvement in such a serious situation. However, as the full implications of the incident began to sink in, Tom's protective instincts overrode his moral judgment. He realized that calling the police would effectively destroy Jake's life and probably land Tom himself in prison as an accessory after the fact. Tom's decision to help cover up Christopher's death was influenced by several factors beyond his emotional attachment to Jake. As a contractor who worked regularly with public institutions, Tom understood how quickly scandals could spread and destroy reputations. He also knew that Jake's involvement in Christopher's death would reflect poorly on Tom's own parenting and potentially cost him lucrative contracts with school districts and other government clients. Most importantly, Tom genuinely believed that Christopher's death had been accidental and that destroying 4 lives, Jake's, Marcus's, Ryan's, and his own, wouldn't bring the dead boy back. The plan Tom devised was both simple and audacious in its scope. Using his legitimate access to Jefferson Middle School as an established contractor, Tom would enter the building after hours under the pretense of conducting emergency repair work in the basement. The story would be that aging pipes had burst near the boiler room, requiring immediate attention to prevent water damage and maintain the building's heating system. Such emergencies were common in Detroit's aging school buildings, and Tom's reputation made his presence after hours completely unremarkable. Tom's first step was to contact Principal Robert Hayes directly, claiming that his routine inspection of the basement mechanical systems had revealed signs of a potential pipe failure that needed immediate attention. Hayes, who was already dealing with the early stages of the investigation into Christopher's disappearance, was easily convinced to authorize whatever repairs were necessary to prevent additional problems. The principal signed a work order that very evening, giving Tom complete access to the basement areas where Christopher's body was hidden. Working alone in the basement of Jefferson Middle School during the early morning hours of March 16th, less than 24 hours after Christopher's death, Tom Morrison began constructing what would become Christopher's tomb. The location he chose was a small alcove near the boiler room that had originally been designed as a storage space for maintenance supplies, but had been unused for years due to its awkward position behind the main heating unit. The construction work required to conceal Christopher's body was more extensive than Tom had initially anticipated. He needed to build a completely convincing wall that would appear to be an original part of the building's structure, while actually hiding the small chamber where Christopher's remains would rest undiscovered for over 5 years. Tom used his professional skills and experience to create a false wall using concrete blocks, mortar, and finishing materials that perfectly matched the existing basement construction. The work took Tom 3 nights to complete, with each session carefully planned around school schedules and security routines. He entered the building after midnight and worked until just before dawn, using battery-powered tools to minimize noise and avoid drawing attention from the night security guard who made periodic rounds throughout the building. Tom's familiarity with Jefferson Middle School's layout and security procedures, gained through years of legitimate work, made it possible for him to move freely through areas where Christopher's body was hidden without triggering any suspicion. During this same period, Principal Hayes was dealing with increasing pressure from Sarah and Michael Johnson, who were demanding more aggressive efforts to locate their missing son. The school's initial response had been to assume that Christopher had simply left campus without permission, but as hours turned into days without any trace of the boy, the situation escalated into a full-scale missing persons investigation. Detective Maria Rodriguez was assigned to lead the case, and her first step was to conduct a thorough search of Jefferson Middle School itself. The timing of Tom Morrison's emergency repairs created the perfect cover for his actual activities in the basement. When Detective Rodriguez and her team searched the building on March 17th, 2 days after Christopher's disappearance, the area where his body was hidden appeared to be an active construction site with legitimate reasons for disturbance and limited access. Tom was even present during part of the police search, ostensibly monitoring his repair work and ensuring that the investigators didn't interfere with critical building systems. Detective Rodriguez later admitted that the presence of ongoing construction work in the basement had influenced her team's search strategy. "We were told that certain areas were off-limits due to safety concerns related to the pipe repairs," she explained during testimony at Jake Morrison's trial. "The contractor assured us that those spaces had been thoroughly inspected as part of his work, and we had no reason to doubt his professional assessment. In hindsight, we should have been more suspicious, but at the time it seemed like a reasonable explanation." The false wall that Tom constructed was a masterpiece of deceptive craftsmanship that fooled not only police investigators, but also school maintenance staff, other contractors, and building inspectors who examined the basement over the following 5 years. Tom had used techniques learned during decades of construction work to artificially age the mortar, distress the concrete blocks, and create the appearance of a wall that had been in place for decades rather than days. The days following Christopher Johnson's disappearance transformed Jefferson Middle School into a pressure cooker of rumors, fear, and carefully maintained lies. While search teams combed the neighborhoods surrounding the school and Detective Rodriguez interviewed hundreds of students and staff members, Marcus Webb, Ryan Torres, and Jake Morrison were engaged in an elaborate performance designed to deflect suspicion while managing their own psychological trauma over what they had done. Marcus Webb, whose natural charisma and social status made him the most effective spokesman for the group, took the lead in crafting their public narrative. In interviews with Detective Rodriguez, Marcus portrayed himself as someone who barely knew Christopher, beyond recognizing him as a quiet kid who got picked on occasionally. Marcus claimed to feel bad about the bullying Christopher had experienced, but insisted that he personally had never participated in anything more serious than typical teenage teasing. Marcus's performance was so convincing that Detective Rodriguez initially considered him a potential witness rather than a suspect. His coach, teammates, and teachers all provided character references describing Marcus as a natural leader with a strong moral compass who often stood up for smaller or weaker students. The disconnect between Marcus's reputation and his actual treatment of Christopher was so complete that investigators never seriously considered him a person of interest during the initial phases of the investigation. Behind this public facade, however, Marcus was struggling with intense guilt and paranoia that began affecting his athletic performance and academic work. His basketball coach, Robert Thompson, later testified that Marcus seemed distracted and unfocused during practices in the weeks following Christopher's disappearance. His shooting percentage dropped significantly, and he began making uncharacteristic errors in judgment during games that cost his team several victories. Ryan Torres faced unique challenges in maintaining his cover story due to his father's position within the Detroit Police Department. Sergeant Miguel Torres was peripherally involved in the investigation into Christopher's disappearance, and he regularly brought home information about the case that Ryan had to pretend to hear for the first time. The stress of maintaining this deception while living under the same roof as a trained investigator began taking a severe psychological toll on the teenager. Ryan's behavior at home became increasingly erratic in the weeks following Christopher's death. His father later told investigators that Ryan had started having nightmares, loss of appetite, and difficulty concentrating on schoolwork. When Sergeant Torres suggested that Ryan might benefit from counseling to deal with the trauma of having a classmate disappear, Ryan panicked and adamantly refused, claiming that talking to a therapist would make him feel worse rather than better. The most volatile member of the conspiracy was Jake Morrison, whose explosive temper and unstable family background made him the greatest threat to the group's carefully constructed cover story. Jake had always been impulsive and emotional, but the weight of having caused Christopher's death was pushing him toward a complete psychological breakdown that could expose the entire conspiracy. Jake's mother, Linda Morrison, was a single parent working 2 jobs to support herself and her son in a rundown apartment complex on Detroit's east side. Linda had struggled with her own demons over the years, including periods of depression and substance abuse that had left Jake largely unsupervised during critical periods of his development. Her relationship with her brother Tom was complicated by financial dependence and old family resentments, but she trusted Tom's judgment when it came to helping Jake navigate difficult situations. In the immediate aftermath of Christopher's disappearance, Jake had confided in his uncle about having nightmares and anxiety attacks, though he was careful not to reveal details that might incriminate either of them. Tom Morrison, who was dealing with his own guilt over the cover-up, tried to provide emotional support to his nephew while reinforcing the importance of maintaining their silence about what had really happened in the school basement. The 3 boys' friendship, which had never been particularly deep or genuine, began showing signs of strain as the investigation continued without resolution. Marcus, who had the most to lose from exposure, became increasingly controlling and paranoid about his co-conspirators' reliability. He began monitoring Jake's behavior obsessively, worried that the unstable teenager might confess under pressure or accidentally reveal incriminating information. Ryan Torres found himself caught between Marcus's demands for absolute loyalty and his own growing guilt over their deception. As the son of a police officer, Ryan had been raised to respect law and order, and the cognitive dissonance between his family values and his participation in covering up a death was causing severe psychological distress. He began experiencing panic attacks during classes and had difficulty sleeping through the night without waking up in cold sweats. The school administration, led by Principal Hayes, was also under enormous pressure to provide answers about Christopher's disappearance. Hayes had authorized Tom Morrison's basement construction work without thoroughly documenting the specific areas involved, and he was beginning to realize that this oversight could create serious liability issues if investigators later questioned the timing and scope of the repairs. Hayes's initial response was to downplay any connection between the construction work and Christopher's disappearance, emphasizing that the repairs were routine maintenance necessitated by aging infrastructure. However, as the investigation dragged on without resolution, Hayes became increasingly concerned about potential negligence lawsuits from the Johnson family and scrutiny from the school district's central administration. The media attention surrounding Christopher's case created additional pressure on everyone involved in the cover-up. Local news stations ran daily updates on the investigation, often featuring interviews with Sarah and Michael Johnson, pleading for information about their son's whereabouts. These broadcasts were particularly difficult for Jake Morrison to watch, as they reminded him constantly of the pain his actions had caused Christopher's family. Detective Rodriguez was becoming increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress in the case. Despite interviewing over 200 people and following dozens of leads, she had been unable to develop any credible theories about what had happened to Christopher or where he might be. The detective was particularly puzzled by the complete absence of evidence suggesting that Christopher had left the school building despite extensive searches of the surrounding neighborhood and waterways. The investigation was further complicated by the school's aging and inadequate security camera system. While cameras had captured Christopher entering the building on the morning of March 15th, there were significant blind spots throughout the school that made it impossible to track his movements completely. The basement area where Christopher had actually died was not covered by surveillance cameras, and the cameras that might have captured Tom Morrison's after-hours activities had conveniently malfunctioned during the critical time period. As the first anniversary of Christopher Johnson's disappearance approached in March 2019, the case had effectively gone cold despite the continued efforts of Detective Rodriguez and the unwavering determination of Christopher's family. The initial media attention had faded as other stories captured public interest, and Jefferson Middle School had settled into an uncomfortable normalcy that pretended the tragedy had never occurred. Sarah Johnson had transformed her grief into activism, establishing the Christopher Johnson Foundation to support families of missing children and advocate for improved school safety measures. She spoke regularly at conferences and community events, sharing Christopher's story and pushing for legislative changes that would require more thorough reporting and investigation of student disappearances. Her public appearances were always accompanied by large photographs of Christopher, ensuring that his face remained visible even as the investigation stalled. The Foundation's work provided Sarah with a sense of purpose during the darkest period of her life, but it also served as a constant reminder of her failure to protect her son from the forces that had ultimately destroyed him. Sarah's relationship with her husband Michael became increasingly strained as they processed their grief in fundamentally different ways. Michael threw himself into his construction work, often staying late at job sites to avoid coming home to the empty house where Christopher's absence was a constant presence. Emma Johnson, now 14 and attending high school, struggled with the complex emotions of being known primarily as the sister of that missing boy. Her academic performance had declined significantly in the year following Christopher's disappearance, and she had withdrawn from social activities and friendships that might have provided emotional support during this difficult period. Emma's guidance counselor recommended therapy, but she refused to participate in sessions that forced her to relive the trauma of losing her brother. At Jefferson Middle School, Marcus Webb had completed his final year as the undisputed king of the institution's social hierarchy. His basketball prowess had earned him a full scholarship to the University of Michigan, where he planned to study business while continuing his athletic career. Marcus had successfully compartmentalized his role in Christopher's death, convincing himself that the incident had been purely accidental and that his subsequent silence was justified by the need to protect himself and his family from unfair consequences. Marcus's public persona as a role model and community leader was carefully cultivated through volunteer work, academic achievement, and inspirational speeches about overcoming adversity to achieve success. His high school graduation speech, which received a standing ovation from the audience, included references to learning from tragedy and supporting classmates who faced challenges. The irony of these comments was lost on everyone except Ryan Torres and Jake Morrison, who watched from the audience with growing discomfort. Ryan Torres had followed his father's footsteps into law enforcement, graduating from the police academy with honors and beginning his career as a patrol officer in suburban Detroit. The training and indoctrination he received reinforced his childhood belief in justice and order, creating an increasingly painful cognitive dissonance with his knowledge of Christopher's true fate. Ryan's performance evaluations consistently praised his dedication and integrity, qualities that made his participation in the cover-up even more psychologically torturous. Ryan's personal relationships suffered as he struggled to maintain intimacy with people who trusted him completely, while knowing that he was living a fundamental lie. His romantic relationships were particularly affected, as he found it impossible to be completely honest with partners who might have provided emotional support during this difficult period. Ryan began experiencing symptoms of depression and anxiety that he attributed to the general stresses of police work rather than his specific guilt over Christopher's death. Jake Morrison's trajectory was markedly different from his co-conspirators, as his psychological instability and troubled family background made it impossible for him to maintain the facade of normalcy that Marcus and Ryan had perfected. Jake barely graduated from high school, his grades having plummeted following Christopher's death, and he was unable to pursue higher education or stable employment due to his deteriorating mental health. Jake's relationship with his uncle Tom became increasingly complex and strained, as both men dealt with their respective guilt over the cover-up. Tom had hoped that time would diminish the psychological impact of their actions, but instead found himself becoming more paranoid and guilt-ridden as the years passed. Tom's construction business began suffering as he became unreliable and distracted, missing deadlines and making errors that damaged his professional reputation. The Morrison family dynamics were further complicated by Linda Morrison's growing awareness that something was seriously wrong with her son and brother, though she had no idea what they might be hiding. Linda's attempts to get Jake professional help were consistently sabotaged by Tom, who feared that therapy might lead to revelations that could expose their conspiracy. This interference created additional tension within the family and prevented Jake from receiving treatment that might have helped him cope with his trauma. Detective Rodriguez continued working on Christopher's case during her spare time, reviewing evidence and following up on occasional tips that inevitably led nowhere. The detective had developed a personal attachment to the Johnson family and felt professional frustration at her inability to provide them with answers about their son's fate. Rodriguez's colleagues began suggesting that she let go of the case and focus on investigations that had better prospects for resolution, but she remained convinced that someone in the community knew what had happened to Christopher. The detective's instincts were correct, but the conspiracy of silence surrounding Christopher's death was maintained by powerful incentives that went beyond simple fear of legal consequences. Marcus Webb's family had significant financial resources and social connections that could be used to protect their son's future. Ryan Torres's father had relationships within the law enforcement community that provided an additional layer of protection. Jake Morrison's uncle had business relationships with school district officials who had their own reasons for wanting. 5 years and 2 months after Christopher Johnson walked into that basement bathroom and never came out, construction workers renovating Jefferson Middle School made a discovery that would shatter the silence forever. The school had been closed for 6 months, undergoing a complete modernization project funded by a federal grant designed to revitalize Detroit's struggling educational infrastructure. On May 18, 2023, workers demolishing outdated sections of the basement found something that would reopen the most haunting cold case in the city's recent history. The renovation crew was using heavy machinery to remove non-load-bearing walls in the basement when foreman Carlos Mendoza noticed something unusual about one particular section near the old boiler room. The wall appeared to be constructed differently from the surrounding structure, using materials and techniques that didn't match the building's original 1960s architecture. When Mendoza's team began carefully dismantling this section, they discovered a hidden chamber behind the false wall that contained the skeletal remains of a child. The immediate response was swift and professional. Mendoza immediately stopped all work and contacted the Detroit Police Department, who secured the scene within minutes and called in the medical examiner's office. Detective Rodriguez, now Lieutenant Rodriguez, after her promotion 2 years earlier, was the first investigator to arrive at Jefferson Middle School since her original search of the building over 5 years earlier. The irony of returning to search the same location where Christopher had actually been hidden all along was not lost on her. The medical examiner's preliminary examination of the remains confirmed what everyone at the scene already suspected. These were the bones of Christopher Johnson. The victim's distinctive thick-rimmed glasses, now broken and corroded but still identifiable, lay near the skull. Fragments of clothing matched the description of what Christopher had been wearing on the day he disappeared. Most conclusively, dental records provided absolute confirmation that the remains belonged to the missing 13-year-old boy. The discovery of Christopher's body transformed the case from a missing person investigation into a homicide inquiry, triggering the most intensive criminal investigation Jefferson Middle School had ever experienced. Lieutenant Rodriguez assembled a team of detectives, forensic specialists, and construction experts to examine every aspect of the false wall that had concealed Christopher's remains for over 5 years. The forensic analysis of the wall itself provided the first major breakthrough in identifying those responsible for Christopher's death and the subsequent cover-up. Construction materials found at the scene were traced to Morrison Construction through supplier records and distinctive techniques that served as a forensic signature of Tom Morrison's work. Tool marks on the concrete blocks matched implements found in Tom Morrison's workshop, which investigators searched under warrant within 48 hours of discovering Christopher's body. Tom Morrison's detailed work diary, which he had maintained religiously throughout his career, became the prosecution's most damning evidence. The entry for March 17, 2018, clearly documented emergency repair work at Jefferson Middle School with the cryptic notation JMS basement wall repair, keep quiet. Phone records from that time period showed dozens of calls between Tom Morrison and his nephew Jake in the days immediately following Christopher's disappearance. Jake Morrison's psychological deterioration accelerated rapidly once Christopher's body was discovered, and the investigation focused on his family's construction company. His girlfriend, Ashley Martinez, who had been protecting Jake's confidences for years, finally came forward with detailed information about his confessions to her regarding Christopher's death. Ashley's testimony provided investigators with their first clear picture of what had actually happened in that basement bathroom 5 years earlier. According to Ashley's account, Jake had told her that Christopher's death had been accidental, the result of a confrontation that escalated beyond anyone's intentions. Jake had described pushing Christopher during an argument about evidence Christopher had collected, documenting the 3 boys' criminal activities and bullying behavior. When Christopher fell and struck his head on the sink, Jake panicked and called his Uncle Tom for help, rather than seeking medical attention that might have saved Christopher's life. The investigation revealed that Christopher's amateur detective work had been more thorough and more damaging than anyone had realized. Digital forensics experts recovered files from Christopher's old computer showing detailed documentation of Marcus, Ryan, and Jake's involvement in theft, vandalism, academic dishonesty, and systematic harassment of multiple students. Christopher had been planning to present this evidence to Principal Hayes on the afternoon of March 15th, hoping to finally force the school administration to take decisive action against his tormentors. Marcus Webb was arrested at the University of Michigan, where he had been maintaining his facade as a successful student-athlete while the investigation proceeded. His arrest made national news due to his status as a scholarship basketball player and the dramatic circumstances of the case. Marcus's lawyer immediately began plea negotiations, hoping to minimize his client's legal exposure by cooperating with the investigation and providing testimony against Jake Morrison and the deceased Tom Morrison. Ryan Torres faced the most complex legal and personal situation of the original conspirators. His position as a Detroit police officer made his involvement in covering up a homicide particularly scandalous, and his department immediately suspended him, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. Ryan's father, Sergeant Miguel Torres, was devastated by the revelation that his son had been involved in Christopher's death and had been lying to him for over 5 years. The arrest and charging of the 3 young men who had been responsible for Christopher's death provided some measure of closure for the Johnson family, but it also opened new wounds as they learned the full extent of what their son had endured before his death. Sarah Johnson's victim impact statement during Jake Morrison's sentencing hearing was one of the most powerful courtroom moments in Detroit's legal history. "You didn't just kill my son on that day in March," Sarah said, addressing Jake directly while fighting back tears. "You killed our family's peace, our ability to trust, our faith in justice. Every day for 5 years we lived in hell, not knowing what happened to Christopher, searching for him, hoping he would come home. You could have ended that suffering at any time, but you chose to let us suffer while you went on with your lives. That's the part I'll never forgive." Michael Johnson's statement focused on the systematic nature of the bullying that had led to Christopher's death and the institutional failures that had allowed the harassment to escalate to a fatal confrontation. He called for comprehensive reforms in how schools handle bullying incidents and demanded accountability from administrators who had ignored his family's complaints about Christopher's treatment. Emma Johnson, now 20 years old and studying criminal justice in college, delivered perhaps the most impactful testimony of the sentencing hearings. She spoke about growing up in the shadow of her brother's disappearance, about the nightmares and anxiety that had dominated her teenage years, and about her determination to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. "Christopher was my protector, my role model, my best friend," Emma said. "He was planning to stand up for himself and other kids who were being bullied, but he never got the chance to see justice done. I've spent my entire adult life trying to finish what he started, working to protect vulnerable children and support families who are searching for missing loved ones. Christopher's death wasn't meaningless if it helps prevent other tragedies like this one." Jake Morrison was sentenced to 18 years in prison after pleading guilty to involuntary manslaughter, tampering with evidence, and conspiracy charges. Marcus Webb received 8 years for his role in the cover-up and the bullying campaign that led to Christopher's death. Ryan Torres was sentenced to 10 years and permanently barred from law enforcement work anywhere in the United States. Principal Robert Hayes, who had facilitated the cover-up by authorizing Tom Morrison's basement construction work without proper oversight, pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and received probation plus community service. His education career was permanently ended, and he was required to pay significant restitution to the Johnson family. The Christopher Johnson case prompted comprehensive reforms in Detroit's school system, including mandatory reporting procedures for missing students, enhanced security measures, improved anti-bullying programs, and regular safety inspections of all school buildings. The Christopher Johnson Foundation, established by his parents, has become a leading advocate for missing children and their families throughout Michigan and neighboring states. Jefferson Middle School was ultimately demolished rather than renovated, with the site transformed into a memorial park dedicated to Christopher's memory. The park includes educational facilities used for anti-bullying programs and community events designed to promote understanding and prevent tragedies like the one that destroyed so many lives. Lieutenant Rodriguez, who never gave up on finding Christopher despite years of frustration and dead ends, received commendations for her persistence and dedication to the case. She has since become a specialist in cold case investigations and regularly speaks at law enforcement conferences about the importance of thorough crime scene searches and the dangers of making assumptions during missing person investigations. The case serves as a sobering reminder that evil often wears familiar faces, that institutional failures can compound personal tragedies, and that the search for truth and justice sometimes takes longer than anyone hopes, but should never be abandoned. Christopher Johnson's story demonstrates both the devastating consequences of unchecked bullying and the power of family persistence in the face of unimaginable loss. Sarah and Michael Johnson continue their advocacy work through the Christopher Johnson Foundation, speaking regularly about their son's case and supporting other families dealing with missing children. Their marriage survived the ordeal and has grown stronger through their shared commitment to preventing similar tragedies and helping other families find the answers they desperately seek. The memorial garden at the site of the former Jefferson Middle School includes a plaque with Christopher's photograph and a quote from his final school essay. "The truth always finds a way to come to light, no matter how deeply people try to bury it. Sometimes it just takes longer than we hope, but justice never truly dies as long as someone keeps fighting for it." Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases across America. Thank you for following Christopher Johnson's story. See you in the next video. In the end, Christopher Johnson found his voice through the persistence of those who loved him, proving that even when buried beneath lies and silence, the truth will eventually surface to demand justice for the innocent.